Filipino workers started America's most famous labor strike. But if you've never heard about it, there's a reason. For decades, we've been told that César Chávez, a Mexican-American labor leader, was the charismatic figure who launched the Delano Grape Strike, one of the most pivotal moments in the civil rights movement. But contrary to popular belief, this historic strike was actually started by Filipino farm workers 60 years ago, on September 8, 1965. And in fact, when they asked César Chávez for help, he actually said no. So what really happened in Delano? Who were the Manongs? And why don't we know about it? Mabuhay! Or hindi bang panganluwid kayo? Welcome back to my channel. It's me, Kirby, Araullo, your friendly Pinoy historian. Filipino workers have shaped American labor history in so many ways that most people don't even realize, that most people never learn about. But sadly, for decades, we've been told the same story. We've been fed the same narrative over and over again. We were told that César Chávez was the face of farm worker justice, that he led the famous Delano Grape Strike. And this story is all around us. Your high school textbooks probably told you about this. I know mine did. The documentaries online say it. There's even this big Hollywood movie about César Chávez. The murals in California celebrate it. And there's a lot of parks and streets that bear his name. In fact, we even have César Chávez Day. So March 31st is an official state holiday in California, Arizona, Colorado, and Texas. Schools are closed and government offices shut down. It is a day to honor the man who supposedly started the farm workers movement. Meanwhile, for the Manongs, we have Itliong Day on October 25th. But the thing is, this was only officially recognized in California schools in 2015. That is 50 years after the strike began. And it is not a state holiday. No government offices closing. Just a symbolic and quiet recognition that most people have never heard of. But here's the thing. The mainstream narrative has a massive problem. It doesn't really tell us what actually happened. The real story does not begin with César Chávez picking up a megaphone or leading a march. It begins with a group of aging Filipino bachelors, men in their 50s and 60s, who had been fighting for justice in America for literally decades before Chávez ever became a household name. These men were called the Manongs, a term of respect and endearment in Ilocano that means elder brother. And they had something that most textbook writers apparently forgot to mention, that the Manongs were seasoned labor organizers with decades of experience under their belts. In fact, this was not the first time they went on strike. But September 8, 1965 tells us a completely different story than the one we've been told for decades. And once you hear what really happened, then you'll have a better understanding of how this was historic, massively historic, and how genuine change, real change, actually happens, not just in America but all around the world. September 8, 1965. Over 1,500 Filipino farm workers walked out of the vineyards. And just like that, they were done. The Manongs were demanding $1.40 per hour, and even by the standards of the 1960s, this was poverty wages for dangerous back-breaking labor in extreme heat. In fact, they didn't even have clean drinking water or bathroom facilities. The Manongs wanted basic dignity and protection from dangerous pesticides. Things that many of us take for granted in any workplace today. They were striking for the right to organize without retaliation. In short, the Manongs were demanding for the farm workers to be treated as human beings. And again, the Manongs were not just random farm workers having some, spontaneous uprising. The Delano Grape Strike was organized by the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, or AWOC, and it was led by men like Manong Larry Itliong, Manong Philip Vera Cruz, and Manong Pete Velasco. These guys were labor veterans. Larry Itliong had been organizing cannery workers in Alaska and farm workers across California for decades. In fact, just months before Delano, Filipino farm workers went on strike in Coachella. Yup, the same Coachella as the music festival. Manong Larry Itliong and AWOC organized grape workers in Coachella in early 1965, winning better wages. But the victory was temporary. The Manongs knew that without broader solidarity, the growers would just play the same divide and conquer tactic. Now, here's what made the Manongs brilliant strategists. They understood something that had been destroying worker organizing for generations. So whenever Filipino workers would go on strike, the growers, the wealthy land-owning bosses, would bring in Mexican workers to break the strike. And whenever the Mexican workers would go on strike, Filipino workers would be brought in to break it. And this cycle goes on. It was a perfect system of divide and conquer. For decades, the growers had been pitting one group against another, not just Filipinos and Mexicans, but other ethnicities as well. Filipino workers and Mexican workers were not enemies by choice. They were forced into this endless cycle by the bosses who knew exactly what they were doing. But by 1965, the Manongs had learned from the decades of abusive and unfair labor conditions. So in short, they knew the game. They had been playing it their whole lives. Manong Larry Itliong had seen the strikes broken this way in the canneries of Alaska. Manong Philip Vera Cruz had watched it happen in California for decades. Manong Pete Velasco and Manong Andy Mutan brought similar experiences from their own organizing battles. The Manongs all understood that timing was everything, and that is why they chose September 8th, during the peak harvest season, when the growers were most vulnerable, and thus they organized 1,500 workers, not just a few dozen. This was all strategic. And in September 1965, the Manongs decided to change the rules entirely. But the thing is, they couldn't do it alone. They needed something that had never happened before in American agriculture: genuine solidarity across ethnic lines. So Manong Larry Itliong and the Filipino leaders did something unprecedented. They approached César Chávez and his National Farm Workers Association. They invited them to join the strike. The Manongs were saying, "Look, we are stronger together, so let's break the cycle once and for all." But sadly, César Chávez said no. And I'm not making this up. When our Manongs approached César Chávez to invite them to join the strike, Chávez was actually very reluctant about it. He thought that the timing was not right. He believed that his organization was not ready for a major confrontation against the growers. Meanwhile, 1,500 Filipino workers were out there on the picket lines facing grower retaliation with no backup because César Chávez said no. Just think about it for a second. For 8 long days, from September 8th to September 16th, the Manongs went on strike alone. These Filipino workers were out there getting harassed by cops, threatened by foremen, facing violence and brutality, and the very real possibility that Mexican workers would be brought in to replace them. I mean, just imagine Manong Larry in this position. You've got 1,500 workers counting on you. And you know from decades of experience that this cycle of ethnic replacement, of divide and conquer, will destroy any chance of victory. I mean, think about it. You've reached out to your potential allies, but sadly, they basically said, thanks, but no thanks. So, what would you do? Do you just give up? Do you just accept that this is just how things are in America? That the working people will always be divided and conquered? Well, the thing is, the Manongs did not give up. Manong Larry kept pushing. He kept making the case for solidarity. Because our Manongs understood something fundamental, that genuine change does not come from playing it safe. It comes from the people who are ready to act, even when others are not ready to follow. Finally, the persistence paid off. The strike was gaining momentum. Grapes were rotting on the vines during peak harvest season. The growers were getting nervous. And finally, César Chávez changed his mind. But only after mounting pressure from his own Mexican-American community, pushing their organization to join the Filipinos. It was only 8 days later, on September 16, 1965, that the Chicano farm workers voted to join the strike in solidarity with the Filipino workers, a day that everything changed. And what happened next was something that had never been seen before in American labor history. Two communities that had been deliberately pitted against each other for decades chose unity instead. Think about how radical that was. These groups had been used as weapons against each other by their bosses, by the growers. I mean, the bosses had spent decades teaching them to see each other as enemies. But this time, in 1965, the Filipinos and the Chicanos said no to all of that. And together, they broke the cycle. But if you think about it, choosing unity and actually achieving it are two different things. Unity is not always pretty. It can be messy, complicated, and always required constant work. And the work was hard. You had language barriers. Ilocano, Tagalog, Spanish, English, all mixing together in the same meetings. You had different organizing traditions, different cultural approaches to leadership. But the Filipinos and Chicanos figured it out. The Filipinos and Chicanos created something extraordinary. They've accomplished what seemed impossible. Everyone in the movement, regardless of their ethnicity or cultural background, gathering together in the historical Filipino Hall in unity and solidarity, supporting one another throughout the struggle. They took care of each other. They shared countless meals together, especially when the times were rough. I mean, just imagine the Filipino Community Center in Delano, filled with workers from different backgrounds, sharing food, sharing stories, planning strategies together. And I've actually been there myself. I've met the families who remember those days and passed down the stories. And more than just a labor alliance, it was truly a community, a beautiful, diverse community. So in 1966, the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, or AWOC, and the National Farm Workers Association voted to officially merge to form what we now call the United Farm Workers. Finally, the two groups were officially united. The Manongs were appointed to key leadership positions throughout the new organization, and this was hundreds of Filipino organizers bringing in decades of collective experience, of collective expertise into a larger movement. The Manongs brought the boycott strategies, the cross-country organizing networks, the understanding of how to sustain labor strikes throughout harvest season, knowledge and wisdom that they had developed, together throughout generations of labor organizing. But even in this moment of triumph, something else was already happening. Something troubling was brewing. This multi-ethnic movement lasted for more than 5 years. The strike that started with 1,500 Filipino workers in Delano quickly spread across California's Central Valley. We're talking about California's biggest industry, major agricultural operations that had never faced anything like this. And the Filipino organizers, the Manongs, were absolutely crucial to making this work. The Manongs traveled from New York to Seattle, organizing actions and boycott, speaking to unions, and educating the public. And that famous 340-mile pilgrimage from Delano to Sacramento in 1966, Filipino workers were right there, carrying their own banners alongside what became the iconic eagle flag of the United Farm Workers. Our Manongs were not just mere participants. They were often leading these efforts. Filipino organizers managed entire regions of the boycott of the entire campaign, drawing on organizing skills they have developed for decades. So this was not just about one man or one charismatic leader giving speeches or going on hunger strike. This was about thousands of people coming together and doing the unglamorous work of grassroots organizing, like making phone calls, stuffing envelopes, standing on picket lines in extreme heat, like literally 100 degrees, convincing skeptical consumers to stop buying grapes, not just in the US, but in different parts of the world. And so, in 1970, they collectively achieved what everyone said was impossible. Major growers signed contracts with the United Farm Workers. Wages were increased. Collective bargaining rights were established. Health clinics were erected. Dangerous pesticides were banned from the fields. It was a massive victory. So let's be clear and be honest. The success of the movement could not be credited to one group or one individual alone, no matter how charismatic. We cannot deny that it was the spirit and the strength of working together in solidarity that ultimately led to the success of the United Farm Workers. This unprecedented and historic victory belonged to everyone who joined the movement. And it wasn't just Filipinos and Mexicans. You also have Japanese Americans, Yemeni Americans, and so many others. It was a collective achievement. It was a massive victory. But sadly, that is not how the story got told. And here is where things get really frustrating. During these 5 years of the struggle, something else was happening. Something that would fundamentally change how this history got remembered. The media began focusing almost exclusively on César Chávez. His religious symbolism, his soft-spoken charisma, his hunger strikes. It all made César Chávez an easy focal point for journalists looking for a story to tell. Meanwhile, Filipino organizers like Manong Itliong were doing the grunt work. They were managing logistics, sustaining picket lines, traveling across the country to build the boycott, to build broader solidarity. But they were not getting the cameras or the headlines. And this pattern was not unique to César Chávez. Mainstream American media has always struggled to tell complex stories about multiracial movements, about multi-ethnic solidarities. But the consequences were nevertheless real. The strategic innovations, the leadership expertise, the things that the Filipino organizers brought to the table, that they brought to the movement, got written out of the stories. And the thing is, it wasn't just about the media coverage. Sadly, this erasure was also happening within the movement itself. Filipino voices were gradually being marginalized within the very organization they had helped create. For example, Manong Philip Veracruz, one of the founding leaders of the entire movement, eventually resigned from the United Farm Workers in 1977. Manong Philip cited how Filipinos were being treated and excluded from major decisions. Just think about how ironic this is. Unknown to many, during the famous hunger strikes of César Chávez, it was actually Manong Philip Veracruz who was at the bedside taking care of César Chávez every single day. The man who literally nursed Chávez throughout his most publicized protest was eventually pushed out of leadership. And sadly, it wasn't just Manong Philip. In fact, Manong Larry Itliong, one of the original leaders of the strike, ended up resigning from the United Farm Workers in 1971, years before Manong Philip. Our Manongs were frustrated by how Filipino voices were being ignored from the movement they started. And to be honest, as a Filipino American and as a historian, it is disappointing for me to see that the efforts and the leadership of our Manongs get overshadowed, or worse, forgotten. Now don't get me wrong, the point is not to take anything away from César Chávez. This is not to minimize the contributions of the Chicanos. They played a major role, no doubt, but movements like this are never the work of just one person. But unfortunately, by the time textbooks were written, by the time documentaries and movies were made, the story had been simplified to focus on just one man, César Chávez. The Manongs who actually started the multi-ethnic United Farm Workers movement had become mere footnotes in their own story. Now you might be wondering, why does this even matter today, 60 years later? Well, here's why. The organizing model that the Manongs created, the multiracial solidarity, strategic timing, grassroots boycott, all of this are still being used by workers today. From Amazon warehouse workers in Staten Island to the fight for caregivers, nurses, fast food workers, even Uber and Lyft drivers organizing for better wages. Throughout the United States, they're all using the Delano playbook. Multi-ethnic coalitions, consumer boycotts, and strategic strikes during peak demand. These were all tactics pioneered by the Filipino farm workers, by our Manongs. But when we erase the origins of these strategies, when we omit the Manongs from the movement they created, we lose crucial lessons about how genuine change can really happen. And if you think about it, if the Manongs were still alive today, many of them, if not all of them, would be at the forefront of many movements, of many struggles against all kinds of injustices and oppression. From racial discrimination to police brutality, and especially for the Manongs, standing up for migrants' rights and pushing back against abusive labor conditions. Because let's face it, let's be honest, many of the things that our Manongs fought against back in Delano, the same injustices are sadly still happening today. Their fight was never just about grapes. It was about dignity, about human rights, and solidarity. And just like the Manongs, we must never lose hope. If we think about it, the lesson is not that one great leader can change everything, no matter how charismatic or how genuine. The true lesson is that ordinary people, when they come together, when we come together in solidarity, we can take on billion-dollar industries and win. But the thing is, we have to remember the history. We have to remember the complete story. Because when we erase people from history, when we forget what actually happened, when we buy into the simplified, romanticized narrative, we don't just disrespect the past. We don't just dishonor history. We also limit our vision for what's possible in the future. The Manongs showed us the way. The Manongs showed us genuine solidarity. Now it is time for us to remember. It is time for us to continue that legacy of genuine solidarity towards peace and justice in our communities. The story of our Manongs is just one example of how our people's histories have been erased or forgotten. And what many people don't even realize is that this solidarity between Filipinos and Mexicans was not just about shared struggle. It was also about shared history and shared heritage, shared cultures. And these connections between our diverse people from both sides of the Pacific goes all the way back over 500 years, long before California even became part of America. And in fact, long before the United States even existed. But that is a story for another video, so stay tuned. And speaking of hidden histories, if you want to dig deeper, I've actually made hundreds of videos and written several books unpacking our people's histories, cultures, and everything in between. All about reclaiming and uplifting the narratives of our people. So check them out in the links below. Maraming salamat po o niloko agya manaklaunay and Kapampangan dakal pong salamat kay Kongan. See you next time in Tagalog kita kits and Kapampangan, Mikitix and in Binisaya, kita aita.